Psalms and our emotions. This is another category where the Psalms are very, very helpful regarding our emotions. So here is the first way that the Psalms, I think, connect with and help us with our emotions. The first is very basic. The Psalms express our emotions. We just talked about that under the fact that the Psalms are intensely personal. The Psalms express our emotions. And they express the full range of human emotion. And of course, we resonate with the Psalms because they're personal. We resonate with the Psalms because they're painful, so they speak to our trials, and also because they're poetic, so they appeal to our taste. For all those reasons, we connect with the Psalms. But we also connect with the Psalms in large part because they resonate with our emotions. So when we turn to the psalmists, when we're in pain, we find people that are sharing in our experiences, and that comes out in the emotional language that they use. So we find not prophets who are preaching to us, but poets who are weeping with us. And that's a very different sense that you get when you approach the Psalms. They express our own emotions. And as we know, the human experience generates this exquisite combination of emotions, like a kaleidoscope of emotions. And on any given day, you can run into a whole host of them, and usually do. And the Psalms portray the entire kaleidoscope of human emotion. And for that reason, they can express our emotions, which is really helpful. A lot of us understand what it's like to be bottling a lot of things up, to be really struggling with some major issues in our lives or some people in our lives, and to find that good friend that we can open up to. And we can find that incredibly therapeutic. There's a good way to do that, seeking help. There's a bad way to do that, gossiping about everybody that's in your life that's mistreating you. But whatever you're doing, and for whatever reason, we find that really helpful. For this reason, the Psalms are very, very helpful, because it's our emotional life vented out, but in a Godward direction, toward God. Not just out as verbal shrapnel for anybody to get hit by that happens to come near, but toward God, which is incredibly helpful. So the Psalms express our emotions. Remember, I'm not saying the Psalms express the psalmist's emotions. They express our emotions, because when we come to them, we realize they get me, like we talked about before. Secondly, with the Psalms and our emotions, the Psalms humanize our emotions. They humanize our emotions. What I mean is, the Psalms implicitly teach us that emotion is not sinful. There are sinful emotions, but emotions are not inherently sinful. And that's really helpful when you're counseling people. I think earlier on, when you're in ministry and counseling people, it's easy to take someone who's really emotional and think, well, you're just out of control, this is inappropriate, and you really should get a hold of yourself, that idea. But as you go through life and you realize how damaging and how destructive the world we live in is, how damaging and destructive our own sin is, you start to realize that when people are non-emotional about sin, that's more of a problem. That's not a really good sign. And so emotions can be a very good indicator. Russell Moore tells the story of walking into the Russian orphanage where he would adopt his 2 boys from, and saying it was an eerie sound to walk into an orphanage and hear it entirely quiet. A room full of babies entirely quiet. Why? Because they have learned by experience that their crying goes unheard. You wouldn't say the lack of emotion and the lack of crying in that room is healthy. You would say that is one of the most unhealthy things, because in this particular place, their cries went unheard. So emotions are not sinful, although they can be. Emotion is human. So I think the Psalms kind of show us that emotions are not just spontaneous chemical reactions that kind of come from people who lack this kind of idealized self-control that characterizes religiously pious people. That's not what emotions are. Just spontaneous reactions that come from people that just don't have the self-control to do otherwise. Emotions are part of the fullness of our humanity. And if you think about the emotional life of Christ as God incarnate, you'll realize if emotions are sinful, then our doctrine of Christ and His perfect life has to be revisited, because He's flipping tables sometimes, He's weeping over people that won't come to Him, He's weeping at the grave of His friend Lazarus. You can't say that emotions are automatically sinful, and the Psalms are one of the ways that we learn this. They humanize emotions. Third, the Psalms, this is very important, the Psalms normalize lament. They normalize lament. And I think we would agree one of the dominant emotions within the Psalter is lament, and the Psalms normalize lament. I have a professor from my college days who lost his 26-year-old daughter in a car accident. And one of the main things he has said over the many years since that has happened is he has learned that Scripture doesn't only allow for, but by its example encourages lament over the sins in our own lives and the sufferings that we experience in the world that we walk through. And to fail to lament is to fail to recognize reality, what sin actually is, and how distorted it is from what God's design is for our world. So the Psalms normalize lament by doing it so often and showing us that it is often in response to things that we ought to lament over. And learning to lament is really key. Let me show you one way that this came out in a counseling scenario one time for me. So I was working with a young lady who had lost an older brother in a car accident. And we were talking about that experience. And one of the things that I found as I was talking with her was that she would over and over again, as she shared, get very emotional, and then she would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, gosh, it's so embarrassing. I wish that I could keep it together. Like, what does this say about me?" And for weeks and weeks as we would talk, she would continue to say that. In other words, she was very embarrassed and ashamed of the fact that she couldn't hold it together. And what that was doing was it was hindering her from being able to be really open in a free way about the horrifying experience that had taken her brother's life. What she was experiencing was actually natural and appropriate. It actually was good. That was a sign of emotional health that she would respond in such a devastated way to something that's truly devastating. If she were calloused, I would have been much more concerned. But I had to help convince her over time that this is a normal experience and it's an appropriate expression, and you don't need to feel ashamed of this. And here's what happened. In order for us to talk about any of the other life decisions that she was trying to make, any of the other things that she was experiencing, any of the other challenges that she faced, before we could talk about those, I had to help her normalize lament. Because if I didn't make it through that roadblock, we weren't really going to be able to move much further. So the Psalms are one major genre of Scripture that help us and help other people normalize lament, to show people that's not abnormal, it should be the normal, part of the normal rhythm of the Christian life. Not the dominant strain, but it should be part of the rhythm, that it's a rhythm of desperation and dependence and deliverance. That's what's always going to be happening in our lives. If we're going to be desperate, we'll have to depend on God and we'll be delivered, but it's always going to be a cycle through the different things that we face, and that's going to generate increased trust in God as we go through those cycles repeatedly. So the Psalms normalize lament. And here's the thing. Sometimes it can feel like, but if we complain to God, doesn't that mean we're not trusting Him? If I complain to God, doesn't that mean I'm not trusting Him? And this is the thing. Psalmic lament is a form of trust. Psalmic lament is a form of trust. It's not a form of doubt, it's a form of trust. Lamenting to God implies several beliefs. When you lament to God, it implies that you believe in His listening ear, you believe in His fatherly care, and you believe in His sovereign power. It implies that you believe those things. You're not saying you don't believe them. You're saying, I believe that you're sovereign, so why don't you change this? You are asking, why isn't this different? But you know that God is sovereign and you know He's in control, and that's why you're asking Him. It implies belief in His fatherly care because you're crying out to the one that you believe cares for you. If you just assumed God doesn't care at all, then why would you be praying? Why would you be lamenting to Him? Lament to somebody else. Complain to somebody else. The one you complain to shows who you trust to give you comfort when you complain, who you trust to have the capability and the willingness to change things when you complain. So psalmic lament is actually a form of trust. In 2011, my wife and I traveled to Rwanda, and we adopted 3 young children from there. And I remember a very powerful experience that illustrates this point. My older daughter, who was 4 at the time, we were in a guest house making the transition from Rwanda back here to the States in Ethiopia. So we were in a guest house in Ethiopia on the 3rd floor. And I was over at a table in the living area, and my 3 new children were playing together, and they were playing together over near some beds that were in the larger room. And as they were playing together, I heard my daughter cry out in one of the very few English words she knew, "Daddy." said, "Daddy," from over on the side of the room. And I looked, and I walked over, and what had happened was one of her new siblings had taken a Matchbox car from her as they were playing. And who did she cry out to in that moment as a form of lament and complaint and a cry for intervention? It was to me. My response in that moment is not, "You don't trust me, stop complaining." My immediate response is to come over, to find out what injustice has disordered her world, and to seek to make it right. I listened to that complaint as a caring father because it is my responsibility out of loving care and control in that situation to make sure that it is orderly and that justice is applied so that it's fair for everyone and every one of those children can flourish. And that's precisely what we're doing when we lament to God. We're saying, my world is disordered. My community is out of place. The way that people are treating one another is wrong. And I'm crying out to you because I know that you're the one that'll care. I know you're the only one that can ultimately change it. And I know that when I cry out to you, you are listening, which means lament is a form of trust. Doesn't mean every complaint we utter anywhere, vertical or horizontal, is a form of trust. It does mean that lament says something about our experiences, and when we lament in a Godward direction, it says something about what we believe about God. And I think we can be very, very poor lamenters in the United States specifically because I think that we try hard to keep it all together. We try hard to look like we have our programs and our ministry structures and our ministry machine running and whirring at a great pace and there's no problems. We just want to show people that that's what's happening and we want to exude that. But the psalmists show us something very different. And part of it is their godliness, part of it is the sufferings that they took part in, and part of it also is, I think, somewhat of a cultural element. That an Eastern approach is often much more emotional, and it's going to symbolize things in a more powerful way through the emotions. And so, when we protest, we get pickets, we get signs and we picket, right? And we go out together and we stand on a street corner very peacefully and we chant things at most. When someone in the Middle East protests, they burn a car. You get that? That's a cultural difference. And I'm not here to make a judgment about what's better or worse. Those are cultural differences. Some things about each of those are better and some things about each of those illustrations are worse. But there is a difference in the way those things are described and how they're expressed. And for that reason, that's one of the reasons why the Psalms from a different culture really help us, and they normalize lament. Okay, to keep going, let me go through a couple other points about emotions. Fourth, the Psalms explain our emotions. They express our emotions, they humanize our emotions, they also explain our emotions. And I just mentioned this, that our emotions are basically ways that we feel and like bodily expressions of realities in the way that we experience them. So it's not just, so for example, it's not just that I am emotionally angry at you because you offended me. That emotion of anger is bound up with a greater worldview and sense of justice at best and vengeance at worst. So it represents something I believe, something that I think, and for that reason, the Psalms help us connect some of those emotions to our circumstances, to our relationships, to our challenges, our perceptions, to our beliefs, to our actions. The Psalms can explain our emotions in different ways. And let me kind of show you how this works in a fifth point. This is the fifth point under the Psalms and our emotions. And this is a little bit nuanced, but I think it's helpful when you think about counseling people and helping people understand themselves or understanding yourself. The Psalms transcribe our emotions. They transcribe our emotions. So they communicate in verbal form what we only can feel in emotional form. And I'll show you how this actually works in the Psalms. The Psalms transcribe our emotions. When you think about it, an emotion could almost be described as a felt thought. Does that make sense? Emotions are almost like a felt thought. There's something that we think, there's a way that we view things, and the world is aligning with that, so we're rejoicing or we're happy. Or the world is not aligning with that expectation or that thought or that way the world ought to work, and so we're frustrated or we're angry or we're envious because the way the world should work is that I have as much as you or more, but actually you have more than me, and so I'm frustrated. But it's, in a way, a felt thought. And so I found one of the most important things that you have to be able to do in counseling or in preaching or discipleship, just any work with people, is to help people translate their feelings into biblical vocabulary and then interpret the vocabulary with the Bible. You have to help people re-express their own emotions in biblical vocabulary, transcribing their emotions, almost getting the feelings down on paper, being able to verbalize them, then interpret what you have in front of you with the Bible, and then addressing it with the gospel. And that's huge. So I just mentioned this example. The settled frustration that you feel toward an inconsiderate spouse is a desire for justice at best or vengeance at worst. Or, for example, the overwhelming anxiety that for some of you may control your attitude far too often and maybe controls your perspective, it's functional distrust. And so you can see how these emotions could be put down as thoughts and ways of thinking of God and yourself and your circumstances. And it's very helpful to do that, and the Psalms often do that for us, because what are they but the thoughts and emotions of individuals that have inscribed those things on paper. And that's really helpful for us to have. So the Psalms are kind of like inscribed emotions. Does that make sense? They're inscribed emotions. They're emotions written down for all to see. And we should be grateful that the Lord has given us such a candid picture of the inner life of the saints that really helps us. So what the Psalms do is they turn feelings into thoughts. They turn feelings into thoughts. And all of a sudden, you can help someone with their thoughts, whereas sometimes feelings can be really ethereal and mysterious and you're not quite sure what to do with them. So the unconscious can become conscious when you are reading the Psalms. And obviously, how many times have we read the Psalms and you've said, that is exactly how I feel. That's exactly how I feel. But you're not watching someone feel something. You're not just watching a guy who's angry, but like you're far away and you can't hear what he's saying. He's just like running around and waving his arms and yelling at somebody nearby. Like, it's not like that. You're saying, I feel, or he feels what I'm feeling, and it's written down. It's in words. And I can interpret that now, and I can understand how to think about my own life in light of that. Using the Psalms can help people put their own emotions into words, like a young Christian soldier maybe who's fresh off a tour of duty in Afghanistan, who is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. You might be in a situation where you say, okay, the Psalms can help you put into words how you feel, and that'll help me help you. Or you can learn how to do that yourself, and you can transcribe emotions into thoughts, and as you preach, people can resonate with what you're saying. Here's a sixth point under the emotions. The Psalms transform our emotions. It's not just that they express our emotions or they normalize lament or they humanize our emotions or transcribe them. It's not just that they kind of help us understand what they are. They actually transform our emotions as well. They affect our emotions. So what they do is the Psalms grab someone's feelings and thoughts about their circumstances and funnel them down toward God and toward meditation on His past works, meditation on His faithfulness. And what that does is it transforms then those emotions, and it changes the way that you can feel. And you can follow a psalm through these twists and turns to where it actually turns you along with it. And this is important, very important to me personally. My wife once went through a very long period of what we would have described as depression. And she was incredibly discouraged. There were some particular challenges with our family that we were going through, and they were things that were just inescapable. It was nothing due to her sin. It was nothing due to her failure. It just was incredibly heavy and difficult, and it was inescapable for a long time. And she was reading Scripture and praying and striving to be in community and sharing with her friends, and I felt like at a loss to be able to help her, and I thought that what she was going through was actually very normal considering the circumstances that she was facing and the burden she was bearing, but she went through this. And it felt to me like Scripture that I might try to share, things we might try to talk about, just felt silent. I don't know if you've ever felt that way. The Bible just seems silent. It just bounces off some glass window between you and Scripture. And then, one day, not in just an immediate way that changed everything, but it was a genuine transformation. Psalm 77 broke through. And there's a turn in Psalm 77 that shows how the Psalms can transform your emotions. Psalm 77. The turn happens around verse 10 and 11. So I want you to follow along and watch how the Psalms, this particular Psalm, can transform the emotions. Psalm 77. Look at what verses 1 to 9 sound like, and then what verses 11 to 20 sound like. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High, and watch this turn happen. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. That's the Exodus in the Red Sea. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And now, this experience of desperation and I can't escape this and I can't escape the ways that I feel has turned into a meditation about the ways of God and the main paradigm of salvation in the Old Testament, which is the Exodus. And all of a sudden, we're saying, before it was like, I can't see God and I don't know where he is. And now it's saying, even in the Exodus, his footprints were unseen, but he was leading through that wall of water. And it's a beautiful picture. But you watch how there's this turn in the Psalms. And if you're praying that psalm, you have to be confronted by that turn as it happens, don't you? Because you're verbalizing, you're praying it, you're inhabiting it. And so you are trying to live out the turn that's happening emotionally and even in his mindset. Because before, what did he say? I remember you, God, and I moan. That's in verse 3. When I meditate, my spirit faints. Meditation is supposed to bring your spirit back alive. He meditates, his spirit faints. But then, verse 11, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. Verse 12, I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Now the effect of his meditation on the works of God from of old is actually transforming him. And the Psalms have this effect. And the Psalms regularly, again, apart from a Psalm 88, regularly have this kind of turn in them. And it's a great way to show all of us that when you're in that cycle of desperation, there ought to be a turn toward dependence, and that dependence always leads to the deliverance of God, not in a health, wealth, and prosperity sense, that God always takes away your circumstances, but that God is present, near, and faithful. And that turn is a beautiful thing that you'll see over and over again in the Psalms. It's like the but God of Ephesians 2. That same transition, we were dead in sin, but God made us alive. That same kind of transition that's all over the New Testament is everywhere in the Psalms. This is what's going on with me, but you, God, have always done this in the past. You've always been faithful in these ways, and you will be faithful into my future. And it becomes the way that we think ourselves when we go through trials. When you pray these over and over again, you start to think this way, so that when you start heading down into that valley, you hit the same turn the psalmist turns and you start to reflect and meditate on the Lord. It creates a pattern in you if you will pray that way through the Psalms. That's why praying the Psalms and singing the Psalms is so vital, because the patterns themselves start to form themselves in us. That's what you want for your life and for the people's lives who you minister to. And then that was the seventh point, and I'll just summarize it for you, that the Psalms reflect a rhythm of desperation, dependence, and deliverance. And I've said that a couple times, but they reflect a rhythm of desperation, dependence, and deliverance. And that helps us with our emotions when we become desperate, because they help to train us to walk the pattern of the Psalter. They reflect a rhythm of desperation, dependence, and deliverance. And isn't that what we want in our churches, right? Isn't that what we want in the lives of people that we care for? That when they begin heading into the valley of the shadow of death, the response is not just, I'm in the valley of the shadow of death and there is no end in sight, we want the response to be, no, pray the rest of Psalm 23. Because the rest of Psalm 23 is what fills out the picture of the valley of the shadow of death, which is, you are in the valley of the shadow of death and there is a shepherd who is leading you through it. And that's ultimately how we want to learn to live through our own sins and through our own trials.